Picture a beach on the coast of Campeche, Mexico. It is sometime in the early 1660s. The smoke from the musket volley has not yet cleared. Spanish soldiers are walking among the bodies, bayonets fixed, checking for survivors. There are none. Every French pirate on that beach is dead. Every man who sailed under the command of a nobody captain from a nowhere town in France has been shot, stabbed, or clubbed into the sand. The soldiers move slowly, methodically, turning bodies over with their boots, stripping rings from fingers, collecting weapons. Flies are already gathering. The Caribbean sun is doing what it always does to the dead, working fast. And underneath a pile of French corpses, pressed flat against the wet sand, a man is holding his breath. His face is smeared with blood that is not his own. He rolled in it when the shooting started, when he saw the first volley cut through the men on either side of him, and understood, in the space of a heartbeat, that this fight was already over. He went down. He pressed himself against the body of a man who had been alive 30 seconds before. He felt the warmth leaving that body as the Spanish soldiers walked closer, their boots crunching on the coral sand, voices calling to each other in a language he understood perfectly because he had spent 3 years of his life serving Spanish-speaking masters in this same Caribbean. He lay still as they stepped over him. He lay still as they searched the bodies around him. He lay still as the hours passed and the sun moved across the sky and the blood on his face dried to a dark crust and the flies landed on his skin, and he did not move, did not flinch, did not breathe any deeper than the shallowest sip of air his lungs could manage. His name was Jean-David Nau. He was nobody, a former indentured servant from a fishing town on the Atlantic coast of France, a failed pirate whose first real command had just ended in a massacre so complete that not a single member of his crew remained alive. He was approximately 30 years old, and he was lying in a pile of dead men. And the only reason he would ever stand up again was that he possessed an animal survival instinct so fierce it bordered on the inhuman. This is not the interesting part. The interesting part is what he became after he crawled out from under those corpses. Because within 5 years, Jean-David Nau would become Francois L'Olonnais, the most feared man in the Caribbean. A pirate so savage that the Spanish gave him a title usually reserved for biblical plagues, Fléau des Espagnols, the Bane of Spain. He would sack cities that were supposed to be impregnable. He would annihilate garrisons that outnumbered him 2 to 1. He would amass fortunes that would make colonial governors weep with envy. He would commit acts so extreme that even other pirates, men who were not exactly paragons of restraint, would speak of him the way people speak of natural disasters, with fear and a kind of bewildered awe at the scale of the destruction. And then the universe, if you believe in such symmetries, would deliver a punchline so perfect it almost feels scripted. The cruelest pirate in Caribbean history would meet the most brutal end imaginable. He would be torn apart, alive, and his ashes would be scattered to the wind so that nothing, not a bone, not a grave, not a marker, would remain to prove he had ever existed. 3 things you need to know. First, how an indentured servant from a French fishing village became the most terrifying man on the Spanish Main. Second, the siege of Maracaibo, one of the most audacious and devastating pirate raids ever conducted, and the methods of a man who turned cruelty into a tactical weapon. And third, the final expedition, the slow unraveling of a man who believed he was untouchable, and what was waiting for him in the jungle of Darien. Let us go back to the beginning, all the way back. Jean-David Nau was born around 1630 in Les Sables d'Olonne, a small fishing town clinging to the western coast of France where the Atlantic meets the Bay of Biscay. To understand what kind of place this was, you need to understand what France was in the 1630s and 40s. This was a country at war. The 30 Years' War was consuming Europe, and Louis XIII's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, was bleeding the treasury to fund military campaigns on multiple fronts. Taxation was crushing. The harvests were unreliable. Famine was not a metaphor, but a recurring fact of life. In the French countryside, peasants lived on black bread and thin soup. And in the coastal towns, like Les Sables d'Olonne, the economy revolved around 2 things: cod and salt. Roughly 100 fishing boats left the harbor twice a year to fish the Atlantic, and the salt marshes along the coast produced the white gold that preserved food across northern Europe. It was honest work. It was also grinding, dangerous, and it paid barely enough to survive. We know almost nothing about Jean-David's childhood, and that silence tells you everything. He was not from money, he was not from a family whose births and marriages were recorded in notary files and parish ledgers for posterity. He was the kind of person 17th century France produced in enormous quantities and discarded without a second thought. One more hungry mouth in a country that had far too many of them and far too little bread to go around. Sometime in the early 1650s, when he was barely in his teens, Jean-David Nau made a decision that would determine the rest of his life. Or perhaps the decision was made for him, by hunger, by desperation, by the simple mathematics of having no prospects and no future in a town where the best a poor boy could hope for was to die old on a fishing boat. He crossed the Atlantic, not as a colonist, not as a sailor with wages and a contract. He crossed as an engage, an indentured servant, which was the polite French term for something that looked, felt, and functioned almost exactly like temporary slavery. The engage system was one of the great, quiet horrors of the 17th century colonial world. Here is how it worked. A young man with nothing, no money, no land, no connections, no future, would sign a contract binding himself to a plantation owner in the French Caribbean for 36 months. 3 years. In exchange, he received passage across the ocean, which took roughly 6 to 8 weeks in the stinking hold of a cargo ship, packed alongside dozens of other engages, many of whom would not survive the crossing. Dysentery, scurvy, typhus. The Atlantic killed them before the Caribbean had a chance to. Those who survived the voyage arrived in a world designed to consume them. The French sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue and Martinique in the 1650s were machines for converting human bodies into profit. An engage was assigned to a plantation and put to work immediately, clearing jungle, planting cane, cutting cane, hauling cane, feeding it into the crushing mills. The work began before dawn and did not end until after dark. The heat was beyond anything a boy from the Atlantic coast of France could have imagined. A wet, suffocating tropical furnace that drained the body of water faster than it could be replaced. The insects carried diseases that had no names in French medical texts: malaria, yellow fever, tropical ulcers that ate through flesh to the bone. Contemporary accounts from the French Caribbean note that of a boatload of engagés arriving from Europe, barely 10 out of 40 might survive to the end of their contracts. 1 in 4. The rest were carried off by disease, by exhaustion, by the casual brutality of overseers, who had no more regard for an engage than for a draft animal. Observers noted that indentured servants were sometimes treated worse than enslaved Africans, not out of any principled concern for the enslaved, but because an enslaved person was purchased property with permanent value, while an engage was a rental that would expire in 3 years, and there was no economic incentive to keep a rental in good condition. Jean-David survived it. We do not know how. We do not know what plantation held him, or what he endured in those years, or who he was when he signed that contract in France, and who he was when the contract expired. What we know is that by approximately 1660, when his 3 years were up, he did not become a farmer. He did not take whatever pitiful reward was offered, a few acres of scrubland, some tools, a handshake, and settle into a quiet colonial life. Something had happened to him in those 3 years. Something had calcified. The boy from Les Sables d'Olonne was gone, and what remained was harder, quieter, and far more dangerous. He drifted to Saint-Domingue, the wild, ungoverned western half of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti, and he fell in with the Buccaneers. Now, the Buccaneers of Saint-Domingue were not the romantic figures that later centuries would invent. They were, originally, hunters. Rough men, many of them escaped engages or deserting soldiers, who lived in the forests of western Hispaniola and survived by hunting the vast herds of wild cattle and feral pigs that roamed the island, descendants of livestock brought by the earliest Spanish settlers and left to breed unchecked when the Spanish abandoned the western coast. These hunters smoked and dried their meat on wooden frames called bucans, using a method they had learned from the Taino and Carib people of the islands. The word bucan gave them their name, Buccaneers, Buccaneers. They were filthy, semi-feral, dressed in leather stiff with dried blood, and they lived outside every law and every society. They answered to no one. But by the 1660s, buccaneering had become a loose synonym for piracy. The herds were thinning, and the men who had once hunted cattle discovered that Spanish merchant ships were considerably more profitable prey. The island of Tortuga, a small, rocky, heavily forested speck of land just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, had become the unofficial capital of a floating republic of thieves. Picture Tortuga in the early 1660s. A harbor crammed with ships in various states of repair, some barely seaworthy, others bristling with stolen cannon. A town of wooden shacks and mud streets, reeking of rum and unwashed men, and the smoke from the boucan frames where meat was still being cured on the hillside above the port. Taverns that were really just rooms with barrels. Women brought from Europe or taken from captured ships. A weapons market where a man could buy Spanish muskets, Dutch pistols, French cutlasses, all of it stolen, all of it for sale. No courts, no churches that anyone took seriously, no law except the crude articles that pirate crews signed before a voyage, dividing up the anticipated plunder before a single shot was fired. The governor of Tortuga, first a man named de la Place, later replaced by the more politically astute Monsieur d'Ogeron, held his position not through any legitimate authority, but through a simple arrangement. He provided the Buccaneers with ships, supplies, and letters of marque that gave their piracy a thin veneer of legality, and in return, he received a generous cut of everything they stole. It was here that Jean-David Nau became Francois L'Olonnais, named after his hometown, and it was here that he began his education in violence. His early career was unremarkable. De la Place gave him a small ship, and L'Olonnais did what every other buccaneer was doing, raiding Spanish coastal settlements, ambushing merchant vessels, learning how to fight, and how to command men who would slit your throat for a disagreement over shares. He was competent. He was ruthless. He was learning. And then his luck ran out completely. On a voyage near the coast of Campeche, in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, his ship was either wrecked or run aground. The Spanish found the survivors. What followed was not a battle, but an execution. The Spanish garrison at Campeche killed every single man in L'Olonnais' crew. Every man except the one who buried himself beneath the deck. Picture the aftermath. The Spanish soldiers have moved on. The beach is silent, except for the sound of the waves and the drone of insects gathering on the bodies. It is hot. The stench is already beginning. And at some point, we do not know exactly when, whether it was hours or whether it was an entire night spent under the weight of dead men, L'Olonnais moved. He pushed the corpses off himself. He stood up on a beach littered with the remains of every man who had followed him. He was wounded, though not seriously. The blood caked on his face was mostly not his own. He looked around at what was left of his command and saw nothing but dead men, dead ambitions, and the Caribbean stretching endlessly in every direction. What he did next tells you everything about what kind of mind was operating behind those blood-crusted eyes. L'Olonnais did not panic. He did not stumble into the jungle and hide. He stripped the uniform from a dead Spanish soldier, dressed himself in it, and walked into the town of Campeche, into the very town whose garrison had just slaughtered his crew. He spoke fluent Spanish, likely learned during his years of servitude, and he used it. He moved through the town posing as a Spaniard. He found a group of enslaved men. Some accounts say French prisoners, others say African slaves, and he convinced them to help him escape. Together, they stole canoes, and in those canoes, paddling across open Caribbean water, L'Olonnais made his way back to Tortuga. But he did more than escape. L'Olonnais was a man who understood the power of narrative, even if he could not have articulated it in those terms. He let word spread. He made sure that the story of the Campeche massacre reached the Spanish authorities, and with it, the news that Francois L'Olonnais was among the dead. He had slaves and contacts whisper the right rumors in the right ears. L'Olonnais is dead, killed at Campeche with all his men. The Spanish believed it. The governor of Havana celebrated it. One less French pirate to worry about. The troublesome buccaneer from Tortuga was gone. And then he came back. L'Olonnais reappeared on Tortuga like a ghost walking out of the ocean. The governor, de la Place, must have dropped his drink when he saw him. But a man who returns from the dead acquires a certain kind of reputation, and L'Olonnais used every ounce of it. He recruited a new crew, men drawn to him now not just by the promise of plunder, but by the legend of the man who could not be killed. He acquired a new ship, and something in his demeanor had changed. Everyone who knew him noticed it. The man who had crawled out from under those corpses in Campeche was not the same man who had been buried beneath them. Something had broken loose inside him, or something had frozen solid. The violence that would define the rest of his life began almost immediately. Shortly after his return, L'Olonnais captured a Spanish vessel. He killed the entire crew except one man. This was not unusual. Pirates killed prisoners regularly. What was unusual was what he did with the survivor. He sent that one man back to the governor of Havana with a message. The message was simple and absolute. Francois L'Olonnais would never give quarter to any Spaniard. Ever. Not in battle, not in surrender, not under any circumstances. Every Spaniard who fell into his hands would die. The governor of Havana was not a man to tolerate threats from dead pirates who had failed to stay dead. He responded by dispatching a warship, a 10-gun vessel manned by 90 sailors and soldiers with specific orders. Hunt down L'Olonnais. Capture him. Bring his head back in a barrel. There was a special executioner aboard, just for the occasion. L'Olonnais captured that warship. The details vary by source, but the outcome does not. He took the ship, killed the entire crew. Some accounts say he beheaded every man on board, and once again spared exactly one survivor. One man. And he sent that man back to the governor of Havana with a second message. And this time, the words have survived verbatim, because the surgeon who later sailed with L'Olonnais recorded them. I shall never henceforward give quarter to any Spaniard whatsoever. And I have great hopes I shall execute on your own person the very same punishment I have done upon them you sent against me. Thus I have retaliated the kindness you designed to me and my companions. The governor of Havana, it is said, swore a personal oath never to send another ship against L'Olonnais. It was simpler, and considerably safer, to pretend the man did not exist. But the consequence of that decision rippled across the entire Spanish Caribbean. Because now every Spanish sailor, every Spanish captain, every garrison commander along the coast knew two things about Francois L'Olonnais. First, that he would never accept surrender. Second, that the only option when facing him was to fight until the death, because the alternative was guaranteed to be worse. By 1666, L'Olonnais was the most dangerous pirate in the Caribbean, and he was about to attempt something that would make everything before look like a rehearsal. Maracaibo. The plan was almost absurdly ambitious, and that was precisely why L'Olonnais chose it. Maracaibo was not a small coastal village waiting to be plundered by a boatload of buccaneers. It was a real city, the center of a prosperous colonial province in what is now Venezuela, a hub of the cacao trade that generated enormous wealth for the Spanish crown. The city sat on the western shore of Lake Maracaibo, an immense inland body of water, one of the largest lakes in South America, connected to the Caribbean by a narrow strait. And that strait was guarded by the fortress of San Carlos de la Barra, a stone fortification mounting 16 cannons, garrisoned by professional soldiers and considered virtually impregnable. Any ship attempting to enter the lake would have to pass directly under those guns. No pirate had ever tried it. No pirate had ever been crazy enough to try it. Further south, across the lake, sat the town of Gibraltar, another wealthy settlement, a major center for cacao exports, defended by its own garrison. Between the fortress, the two cities, and the distances involved, the Maracaibo system was considered one of the safest places in the Spanish Caribbean. It was about to become the site of one of the greatest humiliations the Spanish Empire had ever suffered. L'Olonnais assembled his fleet at Tortuga in early 1667. 8 ships, 440 men. He was joined by another French buccaneer named Michel Le Basque, a man with his own reputation for ferocity and his own following of hardened fighters. Together, they sailed north along the coast of Hispaniola, stopping at settlements and putting out the word. L'Olonnais is sailing for a prize bigger than anything these waters have ever seen. The men came. They came from the forests and the taverns and the shoreline camps, buccaneers and ex-soldiers and escaped servants and men with nothing to lose, until the fleet's complement had swelled to approximately 700 men. 700 men in 8 ships, sailing south toward the richest target in the Spanish Main. On the 30th of July, 1667, they sailed. And before they even reached Maracaibo, fortune handed them a gift so spectacular it almost defied belief. En route, the fleet intercepted a Spanish treasure ship, a merchant vessel carrying a cargo of cacao, gemstones, and more than 260,000 pieces of eight. To put that number in perspective, a skilled craftsman in the 1660s earned perhaps 50 pieces of eight in a year. A colonial official might earn a few hundred. 260,000 pieces of eight was a sum that would sustain a small colonial government. In modern purchasing power, estimates range from $10 to $30 million. It was an enormous haul. Most pirate crews would have turned around, sailed back to Tortuga, and spent the next 2 years drinking, gambling, and spending their way through a fortune. L'Olonnais barely paused. He divided the cargo among his ships and kept sailing south. He had his eyes on a bigger prize. The fleet reached the entrance to Lake Maracaibo. The fortress of San Carlos de la Barra stood before them. Stone walls, 16 cannons trained on the water, a garrison ready and waiting. This was the moment that was supposed to stop any attack before it began. And L'Olonnais did something that no one had considered, because no one had been audacious enough or reckless enough to try it. He ignored the water entirely. He landed his men on the shore outside the fortress. He marched them overland, through the jungle and the scrub, around the fortress walls, and attacked from the landward side, the side that the fortress designers had never bothered to fortify. Because why would anyone attack a coastal fortress from the land? The fortress fell in a matter of hours. The garrison was overwhelmed. The 16 cannons, all pointing uselessly out to sea, might as well have been pointed at the moon. L'Olonnais spiked the guns, took what provisions and ammunition the fortress held, and sailed his fleet through the strait and into the calm waters of Lake Maracaibo. Maracaibo lay open. The pirates entered the city and found it largely abandoned. Word of their approach had traveled faster than their ships. The citizens of Maracaibo had fled into the surrounding forests and swamps, taking their gold, their silver, their jewels, and everything portable with them. They had done what colonists all over the Caribbean had learned to do when pirates appeared on the horizon: run, hide, and hope. But L'Olonnais had not sailed 800 miles and taken a fortress to leave empty-handed. His men fanned out into the countryside. They tracked the fleeing citizens through the forests. They found them hiding in makeshift camps, in remote farmsteads, in the ruins of abandoned missions. And what happened next is what separates L'Olonnais from every other pirate in Caribbean history. He tortured them. Not in the heat of battle, not in the chaos of a raid where discipline breaks down and men do terrible things in the adrenaline of the moment. L'Olonnais tortured systematically, methodically, with calculation and patience and a specific goal: the location of their hidden valuables. One of his preferred methods was something called wolding. A knotted rope was wrapped tightly around the victim's head, and a stick was inserted at the back and twisted like a tourniquet. The rope compressed slowly. The pressure built. The bones of the skull shifted. If the victim did not speak, the eyes were eventually forced from their sockets. This was not quick. It was not a moment of rage. It was applied over hours, to person after person, while L'Olonnais watched with the focused, professional attention of a man performing a task he considered routine. There were other methods: cords tied around thumbs and great toes, the body suspended between 4 stakes, weight hanging on the joints while men beat the victim with sticks, fire applied to the soles of the feet, the rack, a device that stretched the limbs until the joints dislocated. L'Olonnais employed all of them. The message was clear, and it was designed to travel ahead of him. You could flee from L'Olonnais. You could hide your gold in the forest. You could bury it in the swamp. But eventually, he would find you. And the price of silence was worse than anything he would take from your coffers. After 2 weeks of stripping Maracaibo clean, L'Olonnais turned south. He sailed his fleet across the lake toward the town of Gibraltar, the second prize, the cacao port, the town that was supposed to be the backup plan if Maracaibo fell. Here, the Spanish had mounted a real defense. 500 soldiers garrisoned the town, regular troops, disciplined, armed, and fortified behind defensive positions with artillery support. They outnumbered the pirates significantly. The odds, for once, were not in L'Olonnais' favor. It did not matter. L'Olonnais landed his men outside the town, marched them through the jungle, again approaching overland instead of by water, and attacked Gibraltar's defenses head-on. The battle was vicious. The pirates took roughly 40 dead and another 30 wounded, which was heavy by Buccaneer standards. Buccaneer tactics relied on speed, surprise, and terror, not on sustained frontal assaults against prepared positions. But L'Olonnais' men fought with a ferocity that the garrison could not match. The 500 Spanish soldiers were broken. Their losses were catastrophic. Gibraltar fell. The damage L'Olonnais inflicted on Gibraltar went beyond the battle itself. The systematic looting, the destruction of property, the sheer violence of the occupation. It was so devastating that the town, which had been a major center for cacao exports, never fully recovered. By 1680, barely a decade later, Gibraltar had nearly ceased to exist as a functioning settlement. The pirates held both cities for weeks. L'Olonnais demanded a ransom from the people of Maracaibo, 20,000 pieces of eight and 500 head of cattle. The ransom was paid. L'Olonnais took it. And then he continued to loot anyway. When the fleet finally sailed back through the strait, past the ruined fortress, and out into the open Caribbean, they carried a fortune: 260,000 pieces of eight, on top of the treasure ship they had taken en route, along with chests of gems, bales of silk, silver plate, church ornaments, and enslaved people. Each man in the fleet received a share that would have taken a working man years to earn. L'Olonnais, as captain, received considerably more. The news reached every port in the Caribbean within weeks. Francois L'Olonnais, the former indentured servant from a fishing village in France, the man who had once lain under a pile of corpses on a beach in Campeche, had just executed one of the largest and most devastating pirate raids in the history of the Americas. But now it is important to stop and talk about how we know any of this, because the treasure and the tactical brilliance make for a good story. But they are not why L'Olonnais is remembered 3.5 centuries later. He is remembered because of what one specific man wrote about him. Alexandre Olivier Exquemelin, born around 1645, probably in Honfleur, France. The details of his early life are sparse, which is ironic for a man who would become one of history's great chroniclers of other people's lives. What we know is this: Exquemelin crossed the Atlantic as an engagé, the same system of indentured servitude that had delivered L'Olonnais to the Caribbean years earlier. He was sold from his contract with the French West India Company to a barber surgeon who taught him the medical trade. And then, Exquemelin did something that would change the historical record permanently. He joined the Buccaneers. He sailed with them. He patched their wounds. He amputated their shattered limbs on rolling decks with bone saws and leather bite straps. He watched them fight and plunder and torture and divide their spoils. And he wrote it all down. In 1678, back in Europe and now a qualified surgeon registered with the Dutch Surgeons Guild in Amsterdam, Exquemelin published Die Amerikaanse Zeeroovers, the Buccaneers of America. It was translated into German in 1679, into Spanish in 1681, and into English in 1684, and it became the single most important primary source on Caribbean piracy of this era. It is the book that every subsequent pirate history, from Captain Johnson's General History to Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, draws upon, directly or indirectly. Exquemelin had no reason to exaggerate. He was a medical man recording what he had witnessed firsthand, and the unvarnished truth was horrifying enough. He devoted considerable attention to L'Olonnais, and the portrait he painted was of a man whose capacity for cruelty was not a lapse of discipline or a failure of character, but a core operating principle. A man for whom the infliction of suffering was not a regrettable necessity of warfare, but a skill to be honed, a tool to be deployed, and, perhaps most disturbingly, a process that appeared to cause him no visible emotion at all. But the account that has defined L'Olonnais for over 3 centuries, the single image that burns itself into the mind of anyone who encounters his story, comes from the expedition after Maracaibo. In late 1667 or early 1668, flush with the success of Maracaibo, L'Olonnais turned his attention to the coast of Central America. He had captured a Spanish warehouse at Puerto Caballos on the coast of Honduras and looted its contents. He was now marching overland toward the inland town of San Pedro, seeking further plunder. The route took his men through dense jungle, along narrow paths that were perfect for ambush. And the Spanish were waiting. A large force of Spanish soldiers hit the pirates from the trees, It was a well-planned ambush, and L'Olonnais' men were caught in a killing ground. They fought their way out, but barely. The pirates were surrounded. Every path they attempted led to more Spanish soldiers. L'Olonnais needed to know where the ambushes were set, which routes were blocked, and how to reach San Pedro without marching his entire force into another trap. He captured 2 Spanish prisoners. What Exquemelin recorded next is the passage that has echoed down 3.5 centuries. L'Olonnais, enraged and desperate, drew his cutlass and cut open the breast of one of the Spanish prisoners. He pulled out the man's heart with his hands. He bit into it with his teeth. And he turned to the second prisoner and said, "I will serve you all alike if you show me not another way." The second prisoner showed him another way. That is not legend. That is not folklore embellished over centuries of retelling. That is a historical source, written by a man who was there, published within a decade of the events, in a book that became an immediate bestseller across Europe and has never been credibly disputed in its core claims. Whether you choose to believe every detail, whether you allow for some degree of embellishment in the telling, the fundamental reality remains. This was a man who had crossed every line that existed, and then continued walking. And here is where the story turns. Because the universe, or history, or blind chance, or whatever name you prefer for the force that shapes the arc of human lives, was about to close in on Francois L'Olonnais. And the closing would be slow. After Maracaibo, after Honduras, after years of terror across the Spanish Main, L'Olonnais organized his most ambitious expedition yet. It was 1668. He assembled a fleet of 6 ships and 700 men, numbers comparable to the Maracaibo expedition, though the men themselves were different. Many of his most experienced captains, enriched by the Maracaibo plunder, had drifted away. Some had retired. Some had drunk themselves to death. Some had moved on to other crews, other ventures, other captains who seemed less likely to lead them into a war with the entire Spanish Empire. The men L'Olonnais recruited in their place were less skilled, less loyal, and less proven. He was sailing with a fleet that looked impressive on paper, but lacked the core of hardened fighters who had taken the fortress of San Carlos and stormed the garrison at Gibraltar. The plan was to sail south along the coast of Central America, past Honduras, past Nicaragua, toward the Isthmus of Panama, seeking the wealthy Spanish colonial towns that lay along the coast and in the interior. It was a plan that required precise navigation, reliable ships, experienced crews, and a great deal of luck. L'Olonnais had none of these things. Not anymore. From the moment the fleet left port, nothing went right. The winds were contrary. The currents fought them. The fleet was blown off course and ended up in the Gulf of Honduras, far from the intended targets. The pirates raided what settlements they could find, but the pickings were thin. Small villages, empty churches, frightened farmers with nothing worth stealing. The great plunder that L'Olonnais had promised his men failed to materialize. And on pirate ships, unfulfilled promises were more dangerous than enemy cannonballs. Then came the disaster that broke everything. L'Olonnais captured a large Spanish vessel, a prize that should have been a triumph, a vindication of the entire expedition. But his crew, unfamiliar with the handling of such a heavy ship in the treacherous, shallow waters near the Mosquito Coast of Nicaragua, lost control of it. The ship ran aground on a sandbar. They could not free it. The vessel that was supposed to be their salvation became their trap. L'Olonnais ordered his men to break the wrecked ship apart, plank by plank, rib by rib, and build smaller vessels. Longboats, essentially, from the salvaged timber. It was brutal, desperate work, carried out under the Central American sun by men who were already running out of food. They had no shipyard, no proper tools, no pitch to seal the seams. They built what they could with what they had, and what they had was not enough. Foraging parties went inland looking for food and came back with less each time. The jungle offered fruit and palm hearts to men who knew how to find them, but these were sailors, not woodsmen. Some foraging parties came back with nothing. Some did not come back at all, picked off by Spanish patrols or simply swallowed by the jungle. The hunters had become the hunted. L'Olonnais, the man who had terrorized an entire empire, was now eating leather boiled in water and chewing on palm shoots to survive. His crew was disintegrating. The 700 men who had sailed with him were now fragments, small groups, drifting apart, deserting in boats, making their own desperate bids for survival. Some surrendered to the Spanish, preferring imprisonment to starvation. Some simply vanished into the forest. The captains who had joined the expedition began peeling away, taking their ships and their men and sailing for friendlier waters. The great fleet dissolved like sugar in rain. L'Olonnais, who had once commanded 700 fighters and held 2 cities hostage simultaneously, was reduced to leading a handful of desperate, starving survivors along a hostile coast in makeshift boats that could barely stay afloat. He sailed south and east, hugging the coast of Central America, past Nicaragua, past what is now Costa Rica, into the Gulf of Darien, in the waters off present-day Panama and Colombia. He was looking for food. He was looking for a way out. He was looking, perhaps, for one more chance to be the man he had been at Maracaibo. He found something else entirely. The indigenous people of the Darien region, most sources identify them as the Kuna, though some accounts use other names, were not the defenseless villagers and terrified colonists that L'Olonnais had spent years terrorizing across the Spanish Caribbean. The Kuna were warriors. They had been fighting the Spanish for decades. They had launched a revolt against colonial authorities as early as 1614 that lasted more than 20 years. They knew their territory the way a man knows his own hands. The jungle, the rivers, the coastline, the tides, all of it was mapped in their memory. They had fought European invaders to a standstill, driven missionaries out of their land, and maintained their independence through a combination of military skill, political sophistication, and an absolute refusal to submit. They were not afraid of Europeans. They were not impressed by European weapons. And they were certainly not afraid of a handful of starving Frenchmen stumbling out of broken boats onto their shore. L'Olonnais and what remained of his crew were captured. The exact circumstances are unclear, whether it was a battle or an ambush or simply the inevitable end of men too weak to resist. What happened next is clear. The Kuna did to L'Olonnais what L'Olonnais had spent years doing to others. Exquemelin's account is precise, and for once, his prose carries something that sounds almost like satisfaction, the chronicler's grim acknowledgement that the story had arrived at its only possible ending. The Kuna, he wrote, tore him in pieces alive, throwing his body limb by limb into the fire and his ashes into the air, to the intent no trace nor memory might remain of such an infamous, inhuman creature. Limb by limb, into the fire. Ashes scattered to the wind. Not just death, annihilation, erasure. The Kuna did not simply end L'Olonnais. They attempted to unmake him, to erase the physical fact of his existence so completely that nothing remained. Not a bone, not a grave, not a marker, not a single material trace to prove that Francois L'Olonnais had ever walked the earth. He was approximately 38 years old. There is a temptation, when you tell a story like this, to look for a moral. To say that the universe has a sense of justice, that cruelty always returns to its source, that the man who made others suffer was destined, was fated to suffer the most. And the symmetry is almost too perfect to be accidental. The pirate who tore the heart from a man's chest was himself torn apart. The man who tortured prisoners to extract their secrets had his own body taken apart piece by piece. The man who burned cities had his remains fed to the flames. It reads like a parable. It feels like the final act of a morality play, written by someone with a very dark sense of humor. But history does not work that way. History is not a fable, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Most of the cruel men of the 17th century died in their beds. Most of the pirates who tortured and burned and took what they pleased, spent their money, grew old, and were buried in churchyards and forgotten. Henry Morgan, who sacked Panama with methods not so different from L'Olonnais, became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica and died rich and respected. Cruelty in the 17th century was not punished by the universe. It was, more often than not, rewarded. L'Olonnais' end was not justice. It was probability. If you spend your entire life sailing into danger, eventually the danger catches you. If you spend your entire career making enemies of every person you encounter, Spanish soldiers, colonial governors, the indigenous peoples of every coast you wash up on, eventually you find yourself on a shore where you are outnumbered, outmatched, and out of options. The Kuna did not know about Maracaibo. They did not know about the heart on the road to San Pedro. They did not know about the Woulding or the Rack or the thousands of people this man had terrorized across the Caribbean. They simply saw what was in front of them. a group of European invaders on their land. And they responded the way they responded to all such intrusions, with overwhelming and absolute force. What makes L'Olonnais' story linger, what keeps it alive after 350 years, long after the gold has been spent and the ships have rotted and the cities he burned have been rebuilt, is something else. It is the question of transformation. Where does a man like L'Olonnais come from? Not geographically, we know he came from Les Sables d'Olonne, but existentially. Is the capacity for what he became something he was born with, dormant in that boy on the French coast, waiting for the right conditions to emerge? Or was it manufactured? Was it beaten into him in the sugarcane fields? Was it forged on the deck of a pirate ship? Did it crystallize in that specific moment, lying under the corpses in Campeche, breathing blood-scented air, feeling the boot of a Spanish soldier step inches from his face? When Jean-David Nau crawled out from under those bodies, was he already L'Olonnais? Or did L'Olonnais crawl out because Jean-David Nau died there, in the dirt, along with everyone else? The Engage system took a boy from France and fed him into the Caribbean. The Caribbean took what was left and shaped it into something the Spanish would call a plague. The plague burned across the ocean for 8 years, from Tortuga to Maracaibo to Honduras to the shores of Darien. And then the ocean took him back, and the fire consumed whatever was left, and the wind carried the ashes away, and nothing remained. Everything we know about Francois L'Olonnais comes from the accounts of others. From Exquemelin, the surgeon who sailed with Buccaneers and wrote it down with a medical man's precision. From Spanish colonial reports filed by governors who were terrified, humiliated, and desperate to explain to Madrid how a former indentured servant had brought their empire to its knees in the Caribbean. From the oral traditions of the islands, where his name became a synonym for everything that was most terrifying about the age of Buccaneers. He left no letters, no journals, no self-portrait, no confession, no defense. Just a trail of burned cities, shattered garrisons, and a single extraordinary fact: that the Kuna people, who had no way of knowing what this man had done across the Caribbean, decided independently that the correct response to his arrival was total annihilation. Not just death, erasure. As if the land itself, working through the hands of the people who knew it best, was trying to undo the fact that he had ever existed. It did not work, of course. Here we are, more than 350 years later, still telling the story, still trying to understand how a hungry teenager from a fishing village in France became the cruelest pirate who ever lived. Still tracing the chain of cause and effect. Poverty to servitude, servitude to piracy, piracy to massacre, massacre to resurrection, resurrection to empire, empire to jungle, jungle to fire, fire to ash, ash to wind. And still wondering whether the ending he received was something he earned or simply the only way a story like his could possibly end. Because the Caribbean does not care about justice. It never has. It is not a moral universe. It is an ocean, vast and indifferent, and it keeps its secrets the way it has always kept them, beneath a surface that reflects nothing but sky, and the memory of sails long vanished below the horizon. If you have watched this far, there is something about the darkness of history that speaks to you. Something about the way the past refuses to be neat, refuses to be comfortable, refuses to give us heroes when all it has are human beings in extremis. Stay. There are more stories like this one. Stories the textbooks leave out because they are too strange, too brutal, or too true. And if you do not come back for the next one, just remember, somewhere in the Gulf of Darien, the wind still carries the ashes of a man who thought he was invincible. And the Kuna are still there, and they have very long memories.